Story 1. It was a cold, moonless night when I found myself driving down a desolate stretch of highway. The only source of illumination came from the dim glow of my truck's headlights, casting eerie shadows on the road ahead. The hum of the engine was my only companion as I pushed through the darkness. I had been on the road for hours, delivering a shipment of goods to a remote town. My eyelids were heavy with exhaustion, but I knew I had to keep going. The pay for this job was too good to pass up, and I couldn't afford to lose it. As I drove deeper into the night, an unsettling feeling settled over me. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, that something lurked in the darkness just beyond the reach of my headlights. I chalked it up to fatigue and tried to focus on the road ahead. But then, I heard it, a faint, ghostly whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It sent shivers down my spine. I strained to make out the words, but they were indecipherable, like the whispers of lost souls carried on the wind. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I had heard stories from fellow truckers about this stretch of highway, rumors of strange happenings and encounters with the paranormal. I had always dismissed them as the ramblings of tired minds, but now, I wasn't so sure. My unease deepened as I approached a dilapidated roadside motel. The flickering neon sign read vacancy, but the place looked like it had been abandoned for years. I couldn't imagine anyone staying there willingly. As I drove past the motel, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a woman, her pale face illuminated by the glow of my headlights. She was dressed in a tattered white gown that billowed in the wind. Her eyes were empty sockets, and her skin was ashen. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. I had seen enough horror movies to know that picking up a ghostly hitchhiker was a terrible idea, but something compelled me to stop. The woman extended a bony hand toward me, her ghostly whisper growing louder. Without thinking, I rolled down the window and asked, "Are you okay?" The woman's voice was a mournful wail, and she repeated the same phrase over and over, "Help me, please." I hesitated for a moment, torn between fear and compassion. Then, I made a decision and unlocked the passenger door. She climbed in, her cold presence sending chills through the cab of my truck. As I drove, the woman's whispering grew more frantic, and I couldn't understand what she was saying. I tried to calm her down, but she only grew more agitated. It was then that I noticed the temperature in the cab dropping rapidly, despite the heater being on full blast. I stole a glance at the rearview mirror and saw her reflection, her hollow eye socket staring directly at me. In a sudden, bone-chilling realization, I understood her words. She wasn't asking for help, she was warning me to run. With a surge of terror, I looked back at the road ahead just in time to see a shadowy figure step onto the highway. It was a massive, hulking creature with gnarled horns and red, piercing eyes. It was the stuff of nightmares. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, and the truck roared to life. The woman's ghostly form began to dissipate, and her voice grew fainter. The creature gave chase, but I pushed the truck to its limits, leaving the nightmare behind. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, I found myself safe and alone on the highway, the memory of that nightmarish encounter etched into my mind forever. I had survived the midnight haul, but I would never forget the horrors of that haunted highway. Story 2. The night was thick with fog as I drove my big rig down an unfamiliar, winding road in the backwoods of Louisiana. My GPS had taken me on a shortcut to save time, but it felt more like a journey into the unknown. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and the darkness beyond the headlights seemed to swallow everything in its path. I had picked up a mysterious cargo that evening, a sealed trailer that was off limits to me and my curiosity. The only instruction I received from my employer was to deliver it to a remote location and ask no questions. The paycheck was too enticing to turn down, so I followed orders and hit the road. The fog grew denser, reducing my visibility to almost nothing. I could barely make out the road ahead, but I couldn't stop. I had a deadline to meet. That's when I heard it, a faint, haunting melody that seemed to float through the mist. I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me, but the eerie tune grew louder and more distinct with every passing mile. It sounded like an old, mournful song, sung by a woman with a voice that sent shivers down my spine. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I continued to navigate the treacherous road. The source of the melody remained hidden in the fog, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was coming from inside the sealed trailer behind me. As the melody continued to fill the cab of my truck, I felt a strange compulsion to pull over and investigate. I knew it was a terrible idea, but the haunting music was like a siren's call, drawing me closer to the mystery that lay hidden in my cargo. I finally gave in to my curiosity and pulled the truck over onto the shoulder. The fog was so thick that I could barely see the trailer, but the music seemed to beckon me toward it. I cautiously stepped out of the cab and made my way to the back. With trembling hands, I unsealed the trailer and swung the doors open. What I saw inside froze the blood in my veins. There, in the dim light, stood a ghostly figure dressed in tattered rags. Her eyes were empty sockets, and her skeletal fingers danced over the strings of a rotting violin. The music swelled to a crescendo, filling the air with an otherworldly beauty that was both mesmerizing and horrifying. The ghostly violinist stared at me, her empty eyes piercing my soul. I knew I had made a grave mistake. With a sudden, malevolent grin, the violinist's music turned discordant, and the trailer seemed to come alive. Shadows twisted and contorted, and a horde of ghostly figures emerged, reaching out for me with spectral hands. I stumbled backward, slamming the trailer doors shut and sealing the evil back inside. The haunting melody faded, and the fog began to lift. I wasted no time getting back in the cab and driving away from that cursed place. I delivered the cargo to its destination without ever knowing what it truly was, but the memory of that night haunted my dreams for years to come. I learned a valuable lesson that night: some mysteries are best left unexplored, and some roads should never be traveled. Story 3. It was a moonless night, and I found myself cruising down a long, desolate stretch of highway in the heart of Texas. My headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but an endless ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the horizon. I had been on the road for hours and was growing weary, so I decided to pull over at the next rest stop. As I entered the rest area, I noticed something odd about it. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The place was eerily quiet, devoid of the usual chatter of fellow truckers. It was as if the rest stop had been abandoned, frozen in time. Ignoring the sense of unease that gnawed at my gut, I parked my rig and stepped out into the chilly night. I headed towards the restrooms, my footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. The restroom door creaked open, and a blast of cold air hit me like a wave. Inside, I was met with a sight that chilled me to the bone. The restroom was dilapidated, covered in grime and decay. The mirrors were cracked, and the faucets dripped incessantly. But what caught my attention the most was a reflection in one of the broken mirrors, a ghostly figure, standing in the corner. The figure appeared to be a young woman, dressed in a torn and blood-stained gown. Her skin was deathly pale, and her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. She looked at me with a mixture of sadness and longing. Unable to tear my gaze away, I asked, "Who are you?" Her voice was a soft whisper, filled with sorrow. She told me her name was Emily and that she had died here, at this very rest stop, many years ago. She had been waiting for someone, a trucker like me, to help her find peace. Emily's story unfolded as she revealed the tragic events of her death. She had been traveling with her family when their car broke down at this very rest stop. While her parents had gone for help, Emily had been left behind with her younger brother, who had wandered off into the nearby woods. Her voice trembled as she told me how she had searched for her brother, only to find him lifeless in the woods. Overcome with grief, she returned to the rest stop, hoping for her parents' return, but they never came back. She died alone and abandoned. As Emily spoke, I could feel a deep empathy for her. I knew I had to help her find closure. She led me to the woods where her brother had perished, and together, we found his long-forgotten grave, marked by a simple wooden cross. With a sense of closure and gratitude, Emily's spirit began to fade away, leaving behind a profound feeling of peace and the rest stop. As I returned to my truck and drove away from that haunting place, I couldn't help but wonder if Emily's story was a warning to all who passed through that lonely stretch of highway, a reminder that some tragedies could never be forgotten and some souls could never rest.